I discovered my wife's 15 demands on our kitchen table, so I rejected her ultimatums, reclaimed my self-respect, and rewrote the rules of our marriage. Walking through my front door after a regular Wednesday, I expected the usual quiet house and maybe some leftovers in the fridge. Instead, I found a handwritten list sitting on my kitchen table, like some kind of legal document. 15 numbered demands. My wife had apparently spent her day crafting what she called requirements for our marriage moving forward. I picked up the paper and read through it once, then twice. The demands ranged from ridiculous to insulting. Number 1. Stop leaving dishes in the sink overnight. Fair enough, I thought. Number 7. Limit contact with your college friends to once per month. Getting warmer. Number 12. Ask permission before making any purchase over $50. Now we're talking control. But it was number 15 that really caught my attention. Acknowledge that these changes are necessary for our relationship to survive. The whole thing was written in her neat handwriting, each point carefully numbered and detailed, like she was issuing corporate policy changes. I set the paper down and looked around my own kitchen. This was my house, too. I'd been paying the mortgage for 8 years, maintaining the yard, fixing things when they broke. Yet here was a list treating me like some kind of subordinate employee who needed performance management. The more I read through it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about improving our marriage. This was about establishing dominance. Every demand was designed to make me ask permission, seek approval, or change my behavior to suit her preferences. She wanted me to become someone who checked in before spending my own money, who asked for permission to see my friends, who basically handed over decision-making authority in my own life. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. When she got home from her book club meeting, she was going to expect me to be ready for negotiation. She probably imagined I'd go through each point, maybe argue about a few, and eventually agree to most of them to save the marriage. She had no idea what was actually about to happen. 2 hours later, I heard her car in the driveway. I stayed in the living room reading a magazine, acting like nothing unusual had occurred. She walked in with that expectant look people get when they're waiting for a reaction to something they've done. "Did you see what I left on the table?" she asked, trying to sound casual but clearly fishing for my response. "I saw it," I replied without looking up from my magazine. "And?" She sat down across from me, leaning forward with her hands clasped. "Well, what do you think? I spent a lot of time thinking about what we need to work on." I closed the magazine and looked at her directly. "You spent time thinking about what I need to work on. There's a difference. These are things that would help our relationship," she said, her voice taking on that patient tone people use when they think they're being reasonable. "I'm not asking for anything crazy. You're asking me to get permission to spend $50 of my own money. In what world is that not crazy?" She shifted in her seat. "It's about communication, about making decisions together. No, it's about control, and we both know it." The conversation was just getting started, but I could already see where this was heading. She'd prepared for negotiation, compromise, maybe some pushback on the more extreme demands. What she hadn't prepared for was someone who understood exactly what game she was trying to play. I pulled the list out of my pocket and set it on the coffee table between us. "I've got a counter-proposal," I said, standing up. "But first I want to understand something. Where did this idea come from? Because 8 years of marriage, and suddenly you need to give me a performance review." The question caught her off guard. She'd been ready to defend her list, not explain its origins. And that hesitation told me everything I needed to know about who had really been behind this brilliant idea. Her hesitation lasted exactly 3 seconds before she tried to recover. It came from me, from observing patterns in our relationship that need addressing. "Patterns," I repeated, sitting back down but keeping my eyes locked on hers. "Like me spending my own money without filing a request form first. You know that's not what this is about." "Then explain what it is about, because from where I'm sitting, this looks like a list of ways to turn your husband into your employee." She straightened up, switching to what I recognized as her debate mode. "Fine, let's go through them if you want to be difficult about it." "I'm not being difficult. I'm being direct. There's a difference." She picked up the list and cleared her throat. "Numbers 1 through 5 are basic household responsibilities that you've been neglecting. Neglecting according to whom? Did we vote on dishwashing timelines and I missed the meeting? It's common courtesy. Common courtesy is asking your partner to be more mindful about cleaning up. Common courtesy is not making unilateral demands about timeframes in your own home." She moved to the next section. 6 through 10 are about social boundaries and time management. You mean the ones where I need permission to see friends I've known longer than you? It's about balance, about prioritizing our marriage. I leaned forward. Here's what's interesting about that logic. When was the last time you asked me for permission to go to book club, or to spend 3 hours at brunch with your sister, or to buy that $200 purse last month? That's different. How? She paused, realizing she'd walked into a trap. Because I don't disappear for entire evenings or make major purchases without discussion. I told you exactly where I was going last Friday. I was back by 10 o'clock, and the major purchase you're referring to was a set of tools I needed for fixing the fence. You know, the fence around our house that keeps our property values up. Her confidence was starting to crack, but she pressed on. 11 through 15 are about communication and decision-making as a couple. No, 11 through 15 are about you making decisions and me following them. Let's read number 13 again. I took the paper from her hands. Consult with me before making plans that affect our schedule. That's rich, considering you made this entire list and presented it as non-negotiable without consulting me about anything. I'm trying to improve our marriage. You're trying to control our marriage, and me in it. She stood up, pacing now. You're twisting everything. These are reasonable requests from someone who feels unheard in her own relationship. Unheard? You literally just handed me a list of orders and expected compliance. How is that being unheard? Because you never listen when I bring things up casually. So your solution is to stop bringing things up casually and start issuing ultimatums instead. She stopped pacing and looked at me with frustration. It's not an ultimatum. I stood up and walked to where she was standing. Then what happens if I don't agree to these 15 demands? Silence. What happens? I repeated. We'll have to reevaluate our relationship. There it is, the ultimatum. You just said this wasn't. I walked back to my chair. So let me make sure I understand the options here. Option 1. I agree to ask permission before spending money, limit my friendships, change my habits to match your preferences, and basically turn over decision-making authority in my own life. Option 2, you reevaluate our relationship, which I'm assuming means you threaten to leave. You're being dramatic. I'm being accurate. And here's what you didn't consider when you were crafting this master plan. I sat down and looked at her calmly. You assumed I'd be afraid of option 2. The room went quiet. She stared at me, clearly not expecting that response. You assumed I'd panic at the thought of you leaving and agree to whatever terms you set. You thought I'd negotiate, compromise, maybe talk you down from 15 demands to 10, and we'd call it progress. That's not what I thought. That's exactly what you thought. Because in your mind, the threat of losing the relationship would be enough to make me surrender my autonomy. But here's the thing. You miscalculated. I leaned back in my chair. I'm not afraid of option 2. The color drained from her face. She hadn't expected me to call her bluff so directly. You don't mean that, she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Don't I? Let's think about this logically. You've presented me with a choice between surrendering my dignity and losing my marriage. What you haven't considered is that a marriage where I have to surrender my dignity isn't worth keeping. She sat back down and I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how to regain control of the conversation. Look, maybe I could have approached this differently, she said, switching tactics. But these issues are real. They're things that other wives have told me about their own marriages. And there it was, the truth finally coming out. Other wives, I repeated slowly. So this isn't really coming from you observing patterns in our relationship. This is coming from your friends telling you what's wrong with your husband. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Because 5 minutes ago you said this came from your own observations. Now you're talking about other wives. Which is it? She looked uncomfortable, caught in her own contradiction. We talk sometimes about relationships, about things that work and things that don't. We talk, or they talk, and you listen. Both. Let me guess. Your book club isn't really about books anymore, is it? It's turned into some kind of marriage improvement workshop where everyone compares notes on how to fix their husbands. Her silence confirmed it. So let me paint the picture here, I continued. You sit around with a group of women, probably led by someone who's been married 3 times, and you all share stories about what annoys you about your husbands. Then someone suggests that instead of having adult conversations with your partners, you should make lists of demands. And you thought that sounded reasonable. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You let a group of people who don't live in this house, don't know our relationship, and don't have to deal with the consequences convince you to treat your husband like a problem employee. She stood up again, getting defensive. They're my friends. They care about me. Do they? Because friends who care about you would suggest communication, compromise, maybe even counseling. They wouldn't suggest you write up a list of ultimatums designed to humiliate your partner into submission. You're exaggerating. Am I? Let's look at number 14 again. Acknowledge that my concerns are valid even when you disagree. That's not asking for communication. That's demanding validation regardless of merit. That's asking me to agree that you're right even when you're wrong. I picked up the list and held it up. This entire document is designed to make me smaller so you can feel bigger, and the worst part is you didn't even come up with it yourself. You outsourced your marriage problems to a committee of people who have no stake in the outcome. That's not fair. What's not fair is bringing other people's opinions into our relationship without discussing it first. What's not fair is letting people who don't live here dictate the terms of how we live here. She was quiet for several moments, and I could see her struggling with something. Maybe some of the specific demands could be adjusted, she finally said. Adjusted how? From 15 demands to 12? From asking permission for $50 purchases to 75? You're still missing the point. Then what is the point? I stood up and faced her directly. The point is that you don't get to unilaterally restructure our relationship based on advice from people who aren't in it. The point is that I'm not a project that needs managing or a problem that needs solving. I'm your partner, and partners don't hand each other lists of compliance requirements. But if there are legitimate issues, then you bring them up like an adult. You say, hey, I've noticed you've been leaving dishes in the sink and it bothers me. Can we figure out a solution? You don't write up demand number 1, stop leaving dishes in the sink overnight. She sat back down, looking deflated. I thought this would help us. You thought this would help you. You thought this would give you the upper hand in our relationship and make me more compliant. You thought wrong. I walked over to the window and looked out at our yard. The fence I'd mentioned earlier was still half finished because I'd been working on it every weekend for a month. The garden she'd wanted was flourishing because I'd spent hours researching the right plants and soil conditions. The deck we'd built together last summer was holding up well because I'd insisted on using quality materials even though it cost more. You know what's funny? I said, turning back to her. If you'd approached any of these concerns as conversations instead of commands, we probably could have worked most of them out. But you chose intimidation over communication. You chose ultimatums over understanding. So what happens now? She asked quietly. I looked at her for a long moment. Now I give you my response to your 15 demands. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed a notepad from the drawer. She followed me, watching as I sat down at the same table where she'd left her list of demands. What are you doing? She asked. Writing my response, I said, not looking up. She hovered nearby, trying to see what I was writing, but I kept the notepad angled away from her view. The truth was, I wasn't writing much, just one line, but I took my time, thinking through every word carefully. Is this going to take long? She asked after a few minutes. Good things are worth the wait, I replied. She sat down across from me, drumming her fingers on the table. I could see the anxiety building in her expression. She'd expected either immediate compliance or a heated argument. This calm, methodical approach was throwing her off balance. Can we at least talk about this while you write? She tried. Nothing to talk about yet. I'm still formulating my response. The silence stretched between us. I finished writing and set the pen down, but I didn't turn the notepad around. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and studied her face. Before I share this with you, I said, I want to make sure I understand your position completely. You wrote 15 demands that you expect me to follow. If I don't agree, you'll reevaluate our marriage. Is that accurate? It's not about demands. Yes or no? Is that an accurate summary of your position? She hesitated. Yes. Good. And these demands came about because your book club friends convinced you that this was a good approach to marriage improvement. They didn't convince me. They just helped me see things more clearly. Right. They helped you see that your husband needed to be managed like an unruly employee. And you thought that was insightful rather than insulting. You're twisting this. I'm clarifying this because I want to make sure that when I give you my response, you understand exactly what led to it. I turned the notepad around so she could see what I'd written. There was just one line in the center of the page. Find someone who cares. She stared at it for several seconds, then looked up at me with confusion. What does that mean? It means I'm not participating in your compliance program. It means I'm not negotiating with ultimatums. It means if you want a husband who asks permission to spend his own money and gets approval for his friendships, you'll need to find someone else. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You presented me with 2 options: submit to your demands or face the consequences. I'm choosing option 3, reject the entire premise. She stared at the notepad again. This is ridiculous. You're being childish. Am I? You spent time crafting 15 ways to control my behavior. I spent time crafting 1 way to maintain my dignity. Which approach seems more mature to you? But this doesn't solve anything. It solves everything. You want a husband who'll comply with lists of demands? Go find one. I'm not that guy. She stood up and started pacing again. So, you're just going to throw away 8 years of marriage because you don't want to compromise? I'm not throwing anything away. You did that when you decided to treat me like a subordinate instead of a partner. I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't happen. We can work through this. No, we can't. Because the fundamental problem isn't the 15 demands. It's that you thought making 15 demands was appropriate in the first place. People change. Relationships evolve. You're right, they do. And this is me evolving past the point where I accept being treated with disrespect in my own home. She stopped pacing and looked at me with something that might have been panic. You're really willing to end our marriage over this? I'm willing to end our marriage rather than live in one where I have to ask permission to be myself. The question is, are you willing to end it rather than treat me like an equal? That's not fair. Fair would have been approaching me with concerns and working together to address them. Fair would have been having adult conversations about things that bothered you. What you did was the opposite of fair. She sat back down, and I could see her mind working, trying to find a way back to control. What if we modified some of the demands? She asked. You're still not getting it. The problem isn't the specific demands. The problem is that you made demands at all. But relationships require boundaries. Boundaries are things like, don't cheat on me, or don't spend money we don't have. They're not ask permission before seeing your friends, or acknowledge that I'm right even when I'm wrong. So, there's nothing I can say that would change your mind. I looked at her carefully. There's one thing. What? You could acknowledge that this entire approach was wrong. You could apologize for treating me like a problem to be managed instead of a partner to be respected. You could admit that letting your friends dictate the terms of our relationship was inappropriate. She was quiet for a long moment. And then what? She finally asked. Then we'd have a starting point for an actual conversation about how to improve our relationship. But that would require you to see me as an equal, not as someone who needs to be controlled. I don't want to control you. Yes, you do. You just don't want to admit it. She stared at the notepad for another minute, then pushed it back toward me. This is absurd. You're making this into something bigger than it needs to be. No, I'm responding proportionally to what you actually did. You made this big when you decided to write 15 ultimatums instead of having one honest conversation. Fine, she said, her voice taking on an edge. If you want to be stubborn about this, then maybe we do need to reevaluate things. There it is again, the threat you keep falling back on when you don't get your way. It's not a threat, it's a reality check. I leaned forward and looked at her directly. Let me give you a reality check. You think threatening to leave gives you leverage? You think it makes me more likely to comply with your demands? Here's what you haven't considered. What if I don't care if you leave? The words hit her like a physical blow. She sat back in her chair, clearly not expecting that response. You don't mean that. Don't I? Let's think about what I'd actually be losing. A partner who treats me like an employee. Someone who makes unilateral decisions about how I should live my life. A person who thinks ultimatums are appropriate tools for relationship management. You'd be losing your wife. Would I? Because the woman I married wouldn't have handed me a list of compliance requirements. The woman I married would have talked to me about problems instead of issuing orders. So maybe I've already lost her. She was quiet for several moments, and I could see her struggling to process what was happening. This wasn't going according to her script. What if I tear up the list? She finally asked. What if you do? Would that change things? Would it change the fact that you wrote it in the first place? Would it change the fact that you thought this was appropriate? Would it change the fact that you've spent weeks discussing our private relationship problems with a group of women instead of discussing them with me? People need friends to talk to. People need friends to support them, not to manipulate them into treating their spouses like adversaries. I stood up and walked to the window again. Outside, I could see our neighbor working in his garden. He and his wife had been married for 30 years. I'd never once seen her hand him a list of behavioral modifications. Here's what's really bothering me about all of this, I said, turning back to her. It's not just that you made demands. It's that you thought I'd accept them. It's that you believed I'd be so afraid of losing you that I'd surrender my self-respect to keep you around. That's not what I thought. That's exactly what you thought. You calculated that the threat of ending our marriage would be enough to make me comply. You bet on my fear of being alone. And you're saying you're not afraid of being alone? I'm saying I'm more afraid of being in a relationship where I'm not respected than I am of being in no relationship at all. She stood up and walked over to where I was standing. So what happens now? You just give up on us. I'm not giving up on us. I'm giving up on this version of us. The version where you think you can issue ultimatums and I'll fall in line. But we could work on this. We could go to counseling. Because counseling requires two people who see each other as equals. Right now, you see me as a project that needs fixing. I don't want to lose you, she said. And for the first time, her voice cracked slightly. Then don't treat me like someone you're willing to lose. Don't make threats about reevaluating our relationship every time you don't get your way. So, what do you want from me? I turned to face her fully. I want you to understand that what you did was wrong, not poorly executed or badly timed, wrong. I want you to recognize that partners don't make compliance lists for each other. I want you to admit that you let other people interfere in our marriage in a way that was completely inappropriate. And if I do that, then we can have a real conversation about whatever concerns you have. But it has to be an actual conversation, not you presenting demands and me choosing whether to accept them. She was quiet for a long time, looking down at the floor. I really thought this would help, she said softly. I know you did. That's what makes it worse. You genuinely believed that the best way to improve our relationship was to try to control me. What if I was wrong? You were wrong. The question is whether you're willing to admit it and change course, or whether you're going to keep doubling down on this approach. She looked up at me and I could see something shifting in her expression. Whether it was understanding or just strategic repositioning, I couldn't tell yet. I might have been too direct with how I presented things, she said carefully. Too direct? You handed me a list of orders. That's not too direct. That's inappropriate. I just wanted to be clear about what needed to change. What you wanted was to avoid having to negotiate or compromise. You wanted to dictate terms and have them accepted without question. She didn't respond, but I could see from her expression that I'd hit the mark. Here's my final offer, I said. You can acknowledge that this entire approach was wrong and we can start over with actual communication. Or you can stick with your demands and ultimatums and I'll stick with my response. I pointed to the notepad still sitting on the table. Find someone who cares. She stared at the notepad for what felt like minutes. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she realized that none of her usual tactics were working. The threats hadn't worked. The guilt hadn't worked. The attempts at negotiation hadn't worked. You're really not going to budge on this, are you? She asked. Not an inch. Even if it means ending our marriage, especially if it means ending our marriage. Because a marriage where I have to sacrifice my dignity to keep peace isn't worth preserving. She picked up her original list from the table and looked at it again. Some of these things are reasonable requests. Maybe they are, but the way you presented them wasn't reasonable. And the fact that you're still trying to defend the list instead of acknowledging the problem tells me you still don't get it. I get it. Do you? Because 5 minutes ago you were asking what would happen if you tore up the list, as if the problem was the paper it was written on, rather than the mindset that created it. She crumpled up the list and threw it toward the trash can. It missed and landed on the floor. There. Happy now? I walked over, picked up the crumpled paper, and dropped it in the trash where it belonged. That's a start, but symbolic gestures don't fix underlying problems. Then what do you want me to say? I want you to say that you understand why making demands instead of having conversations was wrong. I want you to acknowledge that bringing your friends into our relationship problems was inappropriate. I want you to admit that threatening to leave every time you don't get your way is manipulative. Fine. I understand all of that. Do you? Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear so we can move past this? She sat back down heavily. I don't know the difference anymore. That's honest, at least. I really did think I was trying to help our relationship. I believe you thought that. But you were helping yourself to more control over our relationship. There's a difference. So where does that leave us? I sat down across from her one more time. It leaves us with a choice. We can either rebuild this relationship on the foundation of mutual respect, or we can end it now before it gets any uglier. What would rebuilding look like? It would look like you accepting that I'm not a project that needs managing. It would look like you bringing concerns to me directly instead of workshopping them with your friends first. It would look like actual conversations instead of ultimatums. And what would ending it look like? It would look like you finding someone who's willing to accept being controlled, and me finding someone who sees me as a partner instead of a problem. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the air conditioner cycling on. She looked around our living room like she was seeing it for the first time. I don't want to start over with someone else, she said quietly. Then don't start over with me, but actually start over. No more lists, no more ultimatums, no more threats about reevaluating our relationship every time we disagree about something. What if we can't agree on things? Then we discuss them like adults until we find a solution that works for both of us, or we agree to disagree and move on. What we don't do is make unilateral demands and expect compliance. She was quiet for several more minutes, and I let the silence stretch. This was her decision to make, and I wasn't going to help her make it. I've been talking to the wrong people, she finally said. Yes, you have. And I approached this the wrong way. Yes, you did. And I probably owe you an apology. You definitely owe me an apology. She looked up at me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for treating you like you were the problem instead of talking to you about problems. I'm sorry for making demands instead of requests. I'm sorry for threatening our marriage instead of working to improve it. I studied her face, trying to determine if this was genuine remorse or strategic repositioning. And I'm sorry for letting other people influence how I treat my husband, she continued. That was wrong, and it won't happen again. Good. That's a starting point. So we can work through this? We can try. But understand that things are going to be different going forward. I'm not going to walk on eggshells waiting for the next list of demands. I'm not going to negotiate with ultimatums, and I'm not going to pretend that what happened here was acceptable just to keep peace. I understand. Do you? Because the next time you have a problem with something I'm doing, you're going to have to come to me directly and have an adult conversation about it. No lists, no demands, no threats. I can do that. We'll see. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. I'm going to finish working on that fence this weekend. If you want to help, you're welcome to. If you want to spend the time figuring out how to communicate like an adult, that's fine too. Can I ask you something? She called after me. What? When you wrote, find someone who cares, what did you mean exactly? I turned back to look at her. I meant that if you wanted a husband who would accept being treated like a subordinate, you need to find someone who cared, more about keeping you around than keeping his dignity intact. And you don't. Not anymore. I care about you, but I care about respecting myself more. The day I stop caring about my own self-respect is the day I become useless to everyone, including you. She nodded slowly. I think I understand that now. Good. Because that's the foundation everything else has to be built on. As I walked into the kitchen, I heard her getting up from the table. A few minutes later, she came in and started helping me clean up dinner dishes without being asked. We worked in comfortable silence, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like we were partners again instead of adversaries. The 15 demands were in the trash where they belonged. Whether we could build something better remained to be seen, but at least now we had a chance. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.